August 8, 1962. The world stopped to mourn Marilyn Monroe. Newspapers across America ran front-page obituaries. Television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news bulletins. Movie theaters dimmed their lights in tribute. Thousands of fans gathered outside her Brentwood home, weeping for a woman they'd never met but felt they knew intimately. Yet inside the small funeral chapel at Westwood Memorial Park, only a handful of people sat in the pews. And among them was a woman most of those millions of mourners had never heard of, Berniece Miracle, Marilyn's secret sister. As she looked down at her sibling's face for the last time, carefully made up by morticians who understood that even in death, Marilyn Monroe had to look perfect, Berniece whispered words that revealed a truth Hollywood had spent millions to conceal. "She looks like she just fell asleep on her own." But Berniece knew things about Marilyn that would remain hidden for another 32 years. She knew about the childhood terror, about being shuffled between foster homes while believing she had no family. She knew about the shared father who abandoned them both, leaving wounds that never healed. She knew about the desperate search for belonging that drove Marilyn into increasingly dangerous relationships with powerful men who saw her as a conquest rather than a person. She'd received late-night phone calls when Marilyn's addictions spiraled out of control, when the pills that were supposed to help her sleep became the only way she could face another day. She'd read letters that revealed the real woman behind the breathy voice and platinum curls, a woman who read Dostoevsky and dreamed of being taken seriously, who feared inheriting her mother's madness, who desperately wanted to be loved for who she was rather than what she represented. Yet for decades, Berniece kept silent while the world created myths about her sister. She watched biographies get published that contained fundamental lies. She saw films made about Marilyn that portrayed her as completely alone in the world. She heard people discuss her sister as if she'd been nothing more than a beautiful body with no real family, no real connections, no real depth. And she said nothing, because that's what Hollywood had demanded. That's what the studio system required. That's what it meant to be Marilyn Monroe's erased sister. This is the story of the woman who knew Marilyn Monroe when she was still Norma Jeane, who watched from the shadows as her sister became an icon, and who carried the weight of family secrets that could have changed everything we think we know about Hollywood's greatest tragedy. If you want to discover the untold stories behind Hollywood's golden age, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the secrets the studios tried to bury. To understand how two sisters could live in the same country, share the same father, and not know each other existed for over a decade, you have to understand Stanley Gifford. He was a man who walked away from his responsibilities with casual cruelty. When Gladys Pearl Baker, Marilyn's mother, became pregnant in 1926, Gifford vanished. He refused to acknowledge paternity, leaving Gladys to navigate single motherhood during the Great Depression while her mental health deteriorated. But Stanley Gifford had done this before. Years earlier, he'd had another daughter, Berniece, with his first wife. The two girls grew up in different states, completely unaware that they shared biological bonds that might have saved them both from isolation. Norma Jeane spent her childhood shuttling between foster homes. The narrative Hollywood would later market emphasized this isolation, the beautiful orphan desperately seeking family. It was compelling. It was tragic. It sold millions of movie tickets, and it was incomplete. In 1938, Bernice's mother reached out to Gladys and discovered that Norma Jeane existed. Bernice, then in her late teens, learned she had a 12-year-old half-sister in California, living a life of institutional chaos. In 1939, Bernice wrote a letter that would begin one of Hollywood's most closely guarded secrets. "Dear Norma Jeane," it began, "we are sisters," 3 words that should have been headline news. 3 words that studio publicists would spend decades ensuring never reached public consciousness. When Norma Jeane received that letter, she was stunned. For years she'd believed herself fundamentally alone, and suddenly there was Bernice. But knowing you have a sister through letters and meeting her face to face are entirely different experiences, and what happened when these two finally came together in 1944 would reveal the depths of what Hollywood's image machine had stolen from both of them. The correspondence between Bernice and Norma Jeane had intensified over 5 years. Letters traveled back and forth between Kentucky and California, filled with the tentative explorations of 2 young women trying to build a relationship from nothing but shared genetics and mutual abandonment. Berniece wrote about her life, her marriage to Berniece Miracle, her hopes for stability after a childhood marked by their father's absence. Norma Jeane wrote about her dreams of escape, her work at the radio plane company during World War II, her recent marriage to Jim Dougherty, a union arranged more for security than love, a way out of foster care rather than a romantic partnership. In 1944, Berniece made the decision to travel from Kentucky to Detroit, where Norma Jeane had gone to visit her husband, who was stationed there with the Merchant Marine. The train journey gave Berniece time to imagine what her sister might be like. Would they look similar? Would they recognize each other? Would the connection they'd built through letters translate into real affection? Or would they be strangers who happened to share blood? When the two women first saw each other at the train station, the recognition was immediate and profound. They looked different. Berniece darker-haired, more reserved in her movements and dress, Norma Jeane already beginning to cultivate the lighter hair and vivacious persona that would become Marilyn Monroe, already understanding instinctively that her appearance was a form of currency in a world that valued beautiful women. But in their eyes, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they both carried the invisible weight of paternal abandonment, they were unmistakably connected. They embraced, and Berniece felt her sister trembling. Norma Jeane, already 18 years old and married, seemed somehow younger, more vulnerable than Berniece had expected. Berniece would later describe that first meeting as both joyful and heartbreaking. She was so young, Berniece recalled decades later, and already there was this quality about her, this desperate need to be loved, to be seen, to matter to someone. They spent several days together, talking late into the night about their childhoods, comparing notes on what they remembered or had been told about their mother Gladys and her mental deterioration, trying to piece together a coherent picture of their father Stanley Gifford, a man who had abandoned both of them without apparent remorse. Norma Jeane confessed her deepest fear that she would end up like Gladys, institutionalized and unable to distinguish reality from delusion, lost in the same mental illness that had destroyed their mother's life. Berniece tried to reassure her, but even then she could see the fragility beneath her sister's bright smile and optimistic words. There was a brittleness to Norma Jeane's hope, a sense that she was constructing her identity from borrowed parts rather than any solid foundation of self. What Berniece didn't know then, what she couldn't have predicted during those days in Detroit, was that she was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would make her sister one of the most famous women in the world, while simultaneously ensuring that their relationship would have to remain hidden from public view. The young woman who embraced her at that train station would soon become Marilyn Monroe, and the studio system would decide that Marilyn Monroe couldn't have a sister. The Hollywood studio system of the 1940s and 1950s operated on a principle of total control that's difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Studios didn't just employ actors, they owned them in ways that would be illegal today. 7-year contracts, renewable at the studio's discretion, gave executives absolute power to dictate every aspect of a performer's public image, their name, their manufactured biography, their romantic relationships, even their supposed personality traits and political beliefs. For someone like Norma Jeane Baker, who signed with 20th Century Fox in 1946 at age 20, this meant submitting to a complete reconstruction of identity that was both thrilling and terrifying. She became Marilyn Monroe, a name chosen by studio executives because it sounded simultaneously innocent and seductive. Marilyn for the Broadway actress Marilyn Miller, Monroe for her mother's maiden name. Her naturally wavy brown hair was bleached platinum blonde and permed into soft curls that became her trademark. Her walk was redesigned by studio coaches who taught her to move in a way that suggested both vulnerability and sexuality. Her voice was coached into that breathy whisper that became instantly recognizable, a vocal affectation that suggested childlike innocence while somehow remaining deeply sensual. Everything about Marilyn Monroe was constructed, designed, marketed, but the most crucial element of the Marilyn Monroe mythology, the foundation upon which everything else was built, was her backstory. The studios understood something fundamental about audience psychology. People didn't just want to see beautiful women on screen, they wanted to feel connected to those women through narratives of struggle, suffering, and eventual redemption. They wanted to believe that beauty and success hadn't come easily, that there had been pain along the way that made the triumph more meaningful. So Marilyn's publicity department, working closely with journalists and fan magazines, crafted a story of complete isolation and abandonment. Press releases emphasized her orphan childhood, painting vivid pictures of a lonely girl shuttled between foster homes and a brief stint in an orphanage. Journalists were fed carefully constructed stories about Norma Jeane's time in foster care, about washing dishes for pennies, about never having a birthday party or Christmas presents, about desperately seeking the parental love she'd never known. Fan magazines published heart-rending first-person accounts, ghost-written by studio publicists, of Marilyn's isolated childhood and her hunger for family. The narrative was consistent across every interview, every profile, every publicity appearance. Marilyn Monroe had grown up utterly alone, with no family connections, no support system, no one who loved her for herself rather than what she could provide. It was compelling. It was sympathetic. It made audiences want to embrace her, to give her the affection and validation the story suggested she'd never received. And it was fundamentally a lie, or at least a dramatic distortion of the truth, because Marilyn had a sister. She had Berniece, who loved her unconditionally, who corresponded with her regularly, who represented a family connection that directly contradicted the carefully constructed narrative of total abandonment. But acknowledging Bernice's existence would have complicated the fantasy. A woman with a supportive older sister living a normal, stable life in the Midwest didn't fit the image the studio was selling. It suggested that maybe Marilyn wasn't quite as desperately alone as the publicity materials claimed. It introduced complexity into a story that worked precisely because of its simplicity. So the studio publicists made a collective decision, likely without ever explicitly discussing it with Marilyn herself. Berniece would be erased from Marilyn's official story. She would become a non-person in the public mythology, a family connection that existed in reality but could never be acknowledged in the carefully controlled world of Hollywood publicity. Berniece understood what was happening. She saw how the fan magazines described her sister's childhood without ever mentioning that Norma Jeane had a half-sister. She read interviews where Marilyn talked about feeling completely alone in the world, statements that must have been painful to make given that they contradicted the reality of their relationship. And Berniece made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She agreed to remain hidden. She didn't seek publicity. She didn't sell her story to tabloids hungry for insider information about Hollywood's biggest star. She didn't try to leverage her connection to Marilyn for personal gain or attention. Instead, she maintained their relationship privately, through regular letters and occasional phone calls, through rare visits that happened away from cameras and journalists, in quiet moments that belonged only to the two sisters. She watched her sister become famous while she remained anonymous, working ordinary jobs, raising her daughter Mona Ray, living the kind of quiet, stable life that Marilyn desperately wanted but could never quite achieve given the chaos and demands of fame. But what was really in those letters between the famous movie star and the unknown sister? The private words they exchanged reveal a Marilyn Monroe the public never saw and the burden Berniece carried by knowing the truth. The letters between Marilyn and Berniece offer a window into the real woman behind the platinum blonde facade. In these private communications, Marilyn dropped the breathy persona and wrote with intelligence and emotional depth. She discussed books she was reading, Dostoevsky, Freud, poetry that Hollywood executives would have been shocked to know interested her. She confessed insecurities about acting, her awareness that many people saw her as nothing more than a body. She wrote about her marriages with painful honesty about her inability to maintain lasting intimacy. To Berniece, Marilyn revealed the terror that haunted her constantly, the fear that she would inherit their mother's mental illness. Gladys had been institutionalized multiple times, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Marilyn lived in constant anxiety that she might be one breakdown away from the same fate. She wrote about moments when she felt reality slipping, when the pressure of being Marilyn Monroe became so overwhelming that she wasn't sure who she really was anymore. Berniece became Marilyn's anchor to reality, the one person who remembered her as Norma Jeane. When Marilyn called late at night, often after taking sleeping pills, Berniece listened. When Marilyn's marriages collapsed, Berniece offered steady support, but the burden of this knowledge was immense. Berniece watched from Kentucky as her sister spiraled into addiction. She knew about the prescription drugs barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to wake up. She knew about affairs with powerful men, including rumored relationships with President John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And she knew all of this while maintaining public silence. By the late 1950s, the calls from Marilyn were coming more frequently, more desperately, and Bernice began to realize that her sister was in a kind of danger that went far beyond anything the movie magazines reported. The period from 1958 to 1962 represented both the peak of Marilyn's fame and the nadir of her mental health. She'd proven herself as a serious actress in films like Some Like It Hot, earning critical acclaim, but the personal cost had been devastating. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was disintegrating. Marilyn knew it was ending long before the official divorce in 1961. She wrote to Bernice about finding notes Miller had written describing her as a disappointment, a burden. The discovery shattered something fundamental in Marilyn's sense of self-worth. Bernice listened to her sister's pain and tried to offer comfort, but she was hundreds of miles away. She couldn't simply drop everything and move to California. And Marilyn, for all her neediness, maintained a pride that prevented her from asking for that level of intervention. She wanted Bernice to be her confidante, not her caretaker. The stories Marilyn told during this period revealed the extent of her exploitation by the industry that had made her famous. She described filming scenes where directors kept her on set for 12 or 14 hours when 4 would have sufficed. She talked about the constant pressure to maintain her weight at levels that left her perpetually hungry and weak. In the summer of 1962, Marilyn's calls to Bernice took on a quality that frightened her sister in ways nothing previous had, because for the first time, Marilyn was talking about endings. The spring and summer of 1962 marked Marilyn's complete professional unraveling. She'd been fired from the film Something's Got to Give after repeated absences. Fox executives, who'd once built their studio around her star power, were now publicly disparaging her as unreliable. The humiliation was profound. At 36, Marilyn faced the terrifying possibility that her career was over. In phone calls to Bernice during this period, Marilyn oscillated between desperate attempts at reinvention and dark hints about giving up entirely. She was tired of the pills, tired of the insomnia, tired of waking up each morning and having to construct Marilyn Monroe from scratch when Norma Jeane just wanted to sleep forever. The last time Bernice spoke with her sister was in late July 1962, just days before Marilyn's death. The call came late at night, Marilyn's voice thick with pills and wine. She mentioned Robert Kennedy. She talked about her mother, about seeing her own possible future reflected in those institutionalized eyes. She talked about being afraid to sleep because of nightmares, but afraid to stay awake because of the thoughts that tormented her in the dark. Bernice stayed on the phone until Marilyn's voice faded into silence. Before hanging up, Bernice said, "I love you, Norma Jeane. Please take care of yourself." There was a mumbled response, and then the line went dead. Within days, Marilyn would be found dead in her Brentwood home. The phone call came on August 5, 1962, but it wasn't from Marilyn. It was from Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's second ex-husband. His voice was broken as he told Bernice that Marilyn was gone. The grief was complicated by the surreal nature of Marilyn's fame. As Bernice traveled to Los Angeles for the funeral, she watched the media frenzy unfold. Television news covered Marilyn's death as a major story. Crowds gathered outside her home. Newspapers published front-page stories, all focused on Marilyn Monroe, the icon, with almost nothing about Norma Jeane, the person. Joe DiMaggio had arranged the service, deliberately keeping it small and excluding Hollywood figures he blamed for Marilyn's destruction. Bernice stood beside the casket and looked at her sister's face, peaceful in a way she rarely seemed in life. The makeup artists had done their work, transforming even death into another performance. But to Bernice, she just looked like Norma Jeane, finally free from the exhausting labor of being the world's fantasy. As she stood there, Bernice thought about all the secrets she carried. She thought about the choice she'd made to remain hidden. Had it been the right decision? The guilt would stay with her for years. After the funeral, Bernice returned to her quiet life carrying a burden that would only grow heavier as the Marilyn Monroe mythology expanded to mythical proportions, because she alone knew how much of it was fiction. The years following Marilyn's death saw an explosion of books, documentaries, theories, and exploitations. Everyone had an opinion about who Marilyn really was and why she died. Conspiracy theories proliferated. Authors who'd never met her published definitive biographies. Through all of it, Bernice remained silent. She gave no interviews. She sold no stories to tabloids. She kept her sister's letters locked away, honoring Marilyn's privacy even in death. But the silence came at a cost. Every time Bernice encountered a new biography that got facts wrong, every time she saw her sister reduced to a caricature, she felt the sting of knowing the truth and being unable to speak it. It took 32 years before Bernice finally broke her silence, and when she did, it would challenge everything the world thought it knew about Marilyn Monroe. In 1994, Bernice published My Sister Marilyn, a memoir of Marilyn Monroe. The decision came after decades of watching her sister's memory be distorted and exploited by people who'd never known her. Bernice was in her 70s, aware that if she didn't speak soon, the truth would die with her. The book revealed details that shocked even longtime Marilyn scholars. It confirmed the existence of letters, providing concrete evidence of Marilyn's intelligence and emotional depth. It offered new information about their shared father and his abandonment. Most powerfully, it challenged the narrative of Marilyn as completely isolated, showing that she'd had a loving sister all along, a sister the studios had deliberately erased. What came through in every interview was Bernice's genuine love for her sister and her frustration with how Marilyn had been remembered. She wanted people to understand that Norma Jeane had been more than her beauty, more than her sexuality, more than her tragic death. She'd been a real person with intelligence, vulnerability, dreams. She'd been someone's sister, someone who'd tried desperately to be loved for who she really was, rather than the fantasy others projected onto her. Today, more than 60 years after Marilyn Monroe's death, Berniece Miracle's story remains relatively unknown. The image of Marilyn as the ultimate orphan has become so entrenched that facts contradicting it struggle to find purchase. But the real story is actually more moving than the Hollywood version. It's the story of two sisters separated by circumstance and a father's cruelty, finding each other against the odds and maintaining a bond despite the industry's determination to erase it. It's about Bernice's loyalty, her decision to love her sister privately rather than exploit that connection publicly. What Bernice understood was that the tragedy of Marilyn Monroe wasn't just about addiction or mental illness or dangerous men. It was about a woman who had love and family available to her but lived in a system that required her to pretend she didn't. It was about an industry so committed to profitable mythologies that it demanded the erasure of inconvenient truths, even when those truths were human relationships that might have provided the support Marilyn desperately needed. Bernice lived until 2014, reaching the age of 94. In her final decades, after publishing her memoir, she occasionally gave interviews about Marilyn, always emphasizing her sister's intelligence, kindness, and the real person beneath the platinum blonde facade. She became a guardian of truth in an industry that preferred comfortable fictions, and she demonstrated a kind of love that Hollywood could never understand, the love that doesn't seek attention or profit, that simply exists because family means something more than what can be sold to an audience. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Berniece Miracle isn't ultimately about Hollywood glamour or tragic celebrity. It's about two girls who shared a father's abandonment and found each other anyway. It's about a woman who chose loyalty over publicity, silence over profit. It's about a bond that survived despite an entire industry working to erase it. Bernice gave her sister what Hollywood never could, unconditional love that didn't depend on beauty, youth, or box office receipts. She remembered Norma Jeane when the world only saw Marilyn Monroe, and when the time finally came to speak, she told a truth that complicated the mythology but honored the reality of who her sister had actually been. That's the story Hollywood tried to erase, and that's the story Berniece Miracle made sure the world would finally know.